Welcome back. Mark, I have canceled my Netflix subscription, signed up for the laser cutting class. And I haven't started a company yet, but after the class, I'll be set. Yeah, gotta pay. Yeah, the price just went up, didn't it? Anyway, welcome back. I'd like to introduce you to the moderator of our first panel session, the new business paradigm shift and impact on traditional models. Deven Desai is an associate professor of law at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, and he will introduce his panelist. Deven?
We're going with a little more of a roundtable-y thing. We're just set up here. I'll talk for a few minutes, and then we have with us Shannon, who's head of marketing at Indiegogo, which, as Mark points out, is one of the key levers in being able to get all these cool ideas out there is raising money, and her company is incredibly important as part of that. And then Doug Cutting, I spent 2 years at Google in the policy side and got to learn tons about things like Hadoop, and then to meet one of the people who took Google ideas to the public is just, for me, an incredible honor. So we have Doug who'll talk to us about what's going on with the cloud and how this all connects to this basic idea of traditional models changing. I want to make sure to thank our hosts, both Mr. Kimura and Mr. Sasso, completely preempted what I thought I was going to say, which is what I would expect from leaders at a thought company like Fujitsu Laboratories. But with that, I'm also impressed because one of the things that was beaten into me very quickly at Google was you evolve or you die. And so any company that's willing to look into the future and say the way we've done things is no longer the way things will be is incredibly courageous, and in my opinion is set up to live for another 25 to 50 years, which if you're a student of corporate history, it's a long time. Most companies don't last that long at all. So in terms of what I think about and the notion of traditional models, intellectual property and the law in general, just a simple thing here, there's sort of a law school 101, that it all came out of steam and railroads, right? The Industrial Revolution. And that's held up pretty well until the last 30-something years because of people in this room, really, and everything going on in Silicon Valley, in Japan, in India, in all the world where you see digitization taking hold in ways that are really astonishing. Now, in my world, intellectual property, copyright was the canary in the coal mine, right? We've seen that change. And it really gets to this question of the traditional model, right? Because the copyright industry, even though it seems very familiar as, okay, it's an intangible. It's not about factories, but it was, right? You had CDs. You had a lot of capital going into making movies. 3D printing fascinated me, not because of patents as patents. The fights about patent thickets, et cetera, we can talk about some other day. What I was interested in, and the reason I wrote the paper called Patents Meet Napster, is because of some of the ideas that we heard this morning. It's that the digitization of things is upon us in a way that's extraordinarily mind-blowing. Someone like me, as we heard this morning, I am the unfrozen caveman lawyer, as the old Saturday Night Live skit was. I cannot design to save my life, but I don't have to anymore, right? There are now scanners, right? AutoCAD has a system that, as I understand it, I can use my phone, take 20 to 30 pictures of an object, upload it to a free software, download it to Blender, clean it up, and I'm good to go, right? MakerBot, to make their market work even better, is offering an even higher end scanner, but it's only $400. So think about your classic widget and your industrial economy, right? All right, how many people in here think patents are part of innovation? Right? If you invent something, you want to patent it. Some of Mark's people do that, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the only reason patents work, in my opinion, is because, and this is the irony, the cost to infringe was high, right? It used to cost a ton of money, ton of R&D to create a lot of these things. And then it also took a lot of money if you wanted to build a factory and rip someone off, to put it in crude terms. But if we think about all of a sudden that creation cost has gone down, that means that at the same time, the ability to compete has also gone way down. The ability to infringe has gone way down. So things that we have to think through then is what's the nature of the firm going forward, right? If the costs have gotten so low that we don't need big factories. As we've heard, the Industrial Revolution sort of in your local shop or practically in your garage. Firm value has to then become something else. And that's where Fujitsu's willingness to ask these questions is incredibly impressive. It's a willing to say, what do we look like as we move forward? And in my opinion, the most interesting things that come up here will be, well, then what about networks, right? Digitization writ large. Not just turning things into a bunch of bits, right? But looking at then the aspects of networking, the ability to create markets that could never have happened before, right? With people in Montana who are doing business with me, who's providing that trust system? For homemade goods, from a lawyer perspective, we do start to wonder, why do I trust that the lighting thing that looked really cool doesn't maybe have secret hydrogen blowing up things? And I know that's not what he said, but when I heard at the same time there are people playing with maybe fusion reactors, right, you get a little nervous. We want incredible ability to create. In nanotechnology, we saw this already. There was a scholar who put it this way: new technology, especially one that democratizes and decentralizes, inspires incredibly high lyrical utopianism, but it can also inspire a sort of melancholy catastrophism. And I think that the answer is actually quite in the middle. And that companies like Indiegogo, companies like Cloudera, are part of getting us right in the middle, where you do want some things a little bit shaky, right, because new entrants come in. At the same time, the most interesting questions going forward are, what's trust going to look like to me in the marketplace? Where do big firms start to provide new values? I think you'll see new winners, and those new big players will be the ones who are providing basically infrastructure, right? The things that allow all the little creative people to not only do it in their garage and unlock it on a local level, but to scale, right? Scale in Silicon Valley, you all know, is sort of what's got to scale. Get outside Silicon Valley. People are a little scared of scale, right? A lot of industries don't know. They want to scale, but they realize that some scale means that everyone can play. So those, I think, are the most interesting things. We're going to try and kick it around. I want to shut up, frankly, so you can hear these folks. And then we'll either play with each other with questions, and certainly want to encourage a full, rousing 50 minutes or so of floor questions. So with that, we'll start with, I guess, just this way across. Shannon can talk to us a bit about where Indiegogo fits into that space. And then Doug, and then we'll also look at some of the, excuse the wonky speech, the negative externalities, the things that people are worried about and what market solutions might come up rather than good old-fashioned, let's clamp it down and turn it into old world regulations and centralized firms.
Yeah, thank you. So for those of you who don't know, Indiegogo is a platform that allows you to fund what matters to you. So whether it's a single mother who wants to, actually this is a real story, a single mother who had 2 children and worked 3 jobs and couldn't save enough to kind of get past the next month's paycheck, had always had a dream of opening a bakery. She decided, this is through a testimonial, her last hope was to try this thing called Indiegogo. She didn't know how it was going to work. She raised $10,000 in 3 weeks and was able to get started. To our partnership with Tech Shop, where we help bring new innovative devices to market every day through people who want to take that next step, market validation, funding, testing, research, et cetera. So that's the platform. But I think we're in an interesting space now, because when we started 6 years ago, the original vision was actually to go into equity crowdfunding. So where people had a piece of the business, and there's been a lot of discussion since then. They ended up going and creating this thing called the perks-based model, because nothing like this existed. So there was no ability to go in and change the market at that level. They knew there was just going to be too many hurdles with the government, et cetera. And it really took 4 years to the Jobs Act with President Obama, and now we're looking at equity crowdfunding. But a perfect example of this battle between regulation and new industries is Mary Jo White, SEC chairman, came in latest hearings about a month ago with a document for equity crowdfunding that was 690 pages of regulations. Right, so that's what we said. So when people ask us if we're going to get into equity crowdfunding, our first answer is, well, we'll see, because the risk will really depend on where this nets out. I mean, you already have internal conflict, which is no surprise here on Capitol Hill, but the internal conflict around a congressman who's actually gone to protest and wants to remove the regulations, Title III, and start all over again with something that's far less regulated and puts more risk on the companies. So this is the space that we play in every day, and I think particularly where, not just equity, but this issue of trust that Deven brought up, for us, we're part of the sharing economy for all intents and purposes. Every day we have new innovations, devices, quantified self products, 3D printers, and we get asked this a lot. How do you regulate? And then we're constantly dealing with this balance between does the community regulate? I mean, we have our trust parameters in place. We have fraud algorithms. We have trust and safety teams, but we really also rely on the crowd. And to some extent, companies like eBay have paved the way in this space, so that you start building things like trust passports and star systems and kind of the Yelp model of crowdfunding. So those are the spaces we're looking at, and it's, I think it's particularly relevant to technology and innovation. We don't necessarily have these challenges in other areas of our business where it comes to the arts or cause-related products. So.
I don't study the history of technology or anything like that, but I think it is clear, as you indicated, we're in the middle of a pretty fundamental revolution, a post-industrial revolution that largely centers around technology and the opportunities created by 50 years of exponential improvement through Moore's Law and observed in lots of components, memory, hard drives, networks, et cetera, have really created a different environment for companies. I've been involved in a couple of sub-revolutions, if you will, within that. One has been the rise of open source software. I think the first few decades of software, we got off to a start which wasn't necessarily the most economical for all of society, for all of the economy. With proprietary software, and I think open source has proven to be a more successful way to deploy software at lower costs to more utility and achieve more utility. I started working primarily in open source in 2000 with a search technology called Lucene, Apache Lucene, that really took off because it was open source. People were attracted to it over commercial alternatives because they could try it without getting into some contractual obligation with a third party who would then have some degree of control over their business that they didn't want to cede if they didn't have to. And we're seeing that again and again be the case. More recently, I've been involved in what you might call the data revolution with all this affordable hardware and affordable software. Industry after industry is adopting technology. As Mark Andreessen puts it, software is eating the world. We see it in, I'm amazed at the folks we talk to, tractor companies, oil companies, healthcare companies, retailers. It's hard to imagine an industry which isn't adopting digital technology. And as they do so, they're generating data. And that data is together, when amassed, draws a picture for an institution of its business, of its operations, of what it's doing, that it can use to understand and improve itself. Again, we're seeing this, that the industries that adopt technology are the ones that are advancing fastest. The companies within an industry that adopt technology are advancing faster than those who aren't. And moreover, those that are harnessing the data that they have are advancing faster yet. So it's becoming, just as open source is becoming a mandate for software, for core software functionality in the markets, I think harnessing the data that businesses are generating is a mandate for more and more businesses. And they can do so economically with open source. The two definitely complement one another, these two trends. So I mean, you were questioning the need for big institutions and to some degree, and I think to me, the big thing that an institution can embody is culture, is a way of doing things, is a comprehension and a competency in some area that it can institutionalize and then help people in that realm. So you can get, you can hire one specialist, but they're not nearly as effective as if you have a large firm that can be globally present and folks can rely on much more than a small boutique. And you want to be able to rely on such things. Certainly the model that Cloudera is following. It's a different world for a software vendor with open source, figuring out how you can make a decent amount of money to sustain yourself. But thankfully, most of you don't have to worry about that puzzle. We can address that, and you can focus on building your businesses using the technology.
Well, that brings up an interesting question, because if I remember correctly, and correct me if my computer science is wrong here, but right, the phrase is with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, is the phrase?
That's the phrase.
And that was shown to be a bit of a problem recently with the, was it the Heartbleed issue?
Yeah.
And so, not saying, don't want to be alarmist, but what I was trying to get at is, to your point, right, there are institutions that sometimes will be able to help with that. And I think what's interesting for both of these is one thing that, for instance, if I were at Indiegogo, would be, as I remember, the basic rules of wisdom of the crowds is that it works because they're independent guesses, right? So there's a real problem with Yelp and star systems, because you have to then build new systems that are better authenticating. And so what might be interesting going forward, it's a weird rift between Heartbleed and this, but let me see if I can pull this off, is when do you find out that there might be a market failure? And how do you address that? As you point out, sometimes with open source, the incentives to provide the full service that a firm normally does aren't always in place, and that might be the moment when institutions, including the government, right? I am not a government hater, by the way. I think that we all underestimate how much the system works well because of some regulation. The pure libertarian model, I'll say straight up, no way. There's no way anyone actually believes that's going to work, in my opinion. We can fight about that in the hallway later if you want. But the core thing then becomes, well, can you use your data to improve the system, right? So patents, I think, actually are facing a fascinating moment where perhaps through large data analysis and machine learning, we could have a system that does prior art analysis that actually works. I think that would be phenomenal. With Indiegogo, I think the most interesting thing would be continuing, as you said, to follow the lead of Amazon and eBay and these others about how do I know that this is someone who I can really trust. Yeah, their first project was fantastic. They were at Tech Shop, and they continue to be an entrepreneur I care about. And the funding sources make sense. Those are interesting, but they also, as we also know, make people really nervous when they say, you took my data and you studied it. So I'm curious what you think about the possibilities there and the pros and cons of data analytics as we try and explain that. Because one of my personal missions is, I think sometimes technologists are so sure and often accurate about what they're thinking here that when you move just a little bit outside Silicon Valley, people have no clue what we're talking about, and they get really scared. So that was a lot, but pick up whatever you feel.
In terms of Heartbleed, I mean, I think the problem was there weren't enough eyeballs looking at Heartbleed. That particular bit of software, it had been neglected. Everyone assumed that everyone else was looking at it, and nobody was, in fact,
So how does
looking
one
at it.
deal with that in an open, distributed, decentralized kind of thing as a small case problem, do you think?
I mean, I think you deal with it by having events like this which focus everyone and tell everyone you can't take it for granted that somebody else is vouching for every component. You need to check and find out who has vouched for it.
Okay.
And that makes a role for vendors in the space like Cloudera to vouch for these components and say they work and address the problems promptly when they don't. I think there's an important role there. More generally about collection of data and people's concerns, I think it's a very valid concern. I worry we've got great potential for making progress by analyzing data. There's also great harm that can be done, and we need to weave the central path. And try to, and I think we can achieve both. I think we can achieve the value without the harm, but we need to do so carefully. We need to not overreact to scandals. We need to try to figure out how we can identify and detect what people are doing and build that trust. It is all about trust. Last thing I want to comment on is patents.
Have fun.
And I don't think you'd be very successful in identifying all the prior art. I've been involved in several patent lawsuits about software I've worked on, and I never would have guessed that someone would take this patent and say that it applies to this software. You can make an analogy at some point, the formal structure of the patent. It's a difficult analogy to make in many cases. I think you've got a lot of folks out there who see software that's valuable, and they've got a patent, and they look for some stretch. And I think that you'd get so many false positives in trying to guess. As a software developer, software patents are essentially a minefield that you have to ignore and just walk across and hope you don't step on one. Yeah. And now and then you do.
No argument, especially on the software side. What I've been seeing is some really, it would radically change the system. Where one, if you were to truly digitize all the disclosures, maybe not as well for software, but for physical objects and other areas, there's a chance that then you could actually use machine learning, because one of the problems is we don't actually have this same power that we're seeing in these other spaces. In other words, there's not a big enough crowd, given the volume that goes through the patent office, is one way to think about this issue. And so what I dream of is that the folks in this room and the folks at Cloudera and Indiegogo, someone goes, wait, I can crack that. I can find a way to automate, to scale it out, to deal with the high volume and send up a better red flag system even of, all right, this is the world that matters, as opposed to, it looks okay and we're all hoping that we don't get sued. In fact, it's part of my cost of doing business. Right? That's what I'm saying. But I'm with you. Right now, very messy.
Yeah, I mean, from a patents perspective, I wouldn't say that's, we're a platform where the agreement is between the contributor and the campaigner. Having said that, what I think you spoke to that, running marketing at Indiegogo and the data science and the data analytics is something that is a challenge from a marketing perspective, I would say every day. But again, I hate to use the same examples, but the Amazons and the recommendation engines that have already been built, there is this kind of slow adoption that we all know is happening in kind of digital and online marketplaces. So from that perspective, we are gathering data, of course, every day on multiple different touch points, but at the same time, we don't want to scare anyone yet, but we're, of course, building in recommendation engines. That's the short answer.
So what are the barriers? Why can't I just go become an Indiegogo then? What do you guys offer that others don't? If we do believe that the world has become pretty much a more flat competitive space.
You mean why?
What is it that makes Indiegogo in that sense? Because we were talking before about branding. So as someone who studies that, I was, I'm curious how you see that function, right? Because at one level, branding has been about, right, just do it, you can fly. Right. Indiegogo probably has a slightly different perspective on that, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think it's interesting. So when crowdfunding started, when Indiegogo started, it was the first company out there before the word existed. So this, going back to 2008, and the challenges that we had at first were just get people, of course, any new emerging marketplace, it's get people to understand actually what the value proposition is. The CEO always tells a funny story where his mother didn't get what he did for years, and then she saw him on CNBC, and then she said, oh, this wonderful thing, and didn't even realize it was Indiegogo, but saw him. So, we're in a place now where there's more visibility, understanding. But even in the year that I've been in Indiegogo, watching the transition on how fast the space is growing, when I came in, a big campaign was $1 million. And now, we have several, I mean, today, we just it's so interesting, solar roadways. It's basically you've heard of this, solar panels that you can walk on. And they've raised $2 million in, I think it's 10 days. That just wasn't possible. You know, I think to the open source issue, we have Canonical out of the UK tried to fund for a mobile device that they hadn't yet created. They'd done the R&D for it, but they had wanted to bring it to market and decided to use Indiegogo and crowdfunding. And they raised $13 million. And so the barriers are changing. I also think from a brand perspective, it's really interesting. Big brands have jumped on, as much as innovation is coming out of places like Tech Shop and accelerators, and using the platform for research, validation, taking things to the next level, and from a development perspective, what I think is super interesting is that you have big brands coming in and using it as a marketing vehicle, but also a vehicle to re-engage their customer. So we've had Honda and Domino's, and sometimes it's the advertising agency that's coming to us, and using Indiegogo as a channel. We had DC Comics do a cause-related campaign where they open their vault from their old comic book, Batman and other, you know, the Avengers, and gave away one-of-a-kind things through their perk. So I think it's happening on both sides, from the innovation and the brand perspective, but connecting to a brand is still highly important, and that happens in the community as well. So everyone thinks, I'll start my campaign, I'll get funded, and that's just not always true. It's about the connecting, the sharing, the showing you're passionate. It's finding, you know, I travel globally, and I've done several events in Australia and the UK, et cetera, where I have everyday people who are like, I want to start a campaign and don't know how to market. You know, I remember first going, I'm like, I don't know if I can really help these people. And the biggest thing that came out of this was so many people didn't really think about where their audience was. And from that perspective, it's just online as it is offline, you have to find your audiences, so, yeah.
And so you're saying, Doug, it's sort of, you have to deal with the back end of openness, but how does openness really play out at an area where you absolutely do need firms, right? I wasn't saying firms are going away, but if you could say a little more then about, in general, that networking that is another platform.
So,
how does that play?
We, on the bulk of the technology we ship, we collaborate with our competitors very closely on, and we believe the reason that the software, that Hadoop and all the tools around it have been so successful is that people can adopt them without fear of becoming subject to the whims of a vendor in terms of pricing, and we don't want to sacrifice that. At the same time, we do need to provide something unique, which is better, and so that customers will prefer us. What we've done is we've identified some software, some technology that is proprietary, but which doesn't lock people in to our implementation. In particular, it's the software that people use to deploy and monitor and tune, configure the system, rather than anything that's their application uses. So the applications, they could switch to a different vendor without changing their applications at all, but the people who are running their systems might need to learn some new skills in how to run them, because the operator tools are our proprietary advantage. And so we believe we have substantially better tools for people operating the cluster than anything else available. So that's a technical edge. But we also have very substantial investment in people who know the technology. As I said, we're investing in all these open source technology. The vast majority of our engineering effort is in open source, which gives us, and more so than anyone else in the space, gives us the capacity to better support our customers. When they have a problem, we've got somebody who is involved in writing that software who can help fix the problem. When they need a feature, we've got the people who are adding the features who know how everything works, how to integrate it best. So that's a huge component. And then I think lastly, there's of course brand. We've been doing this, providing support and services around Hadoop longer than anyone else. We've got more customers who we're keeping happier and retaining better. And over time, that you build up a reputation. If you can sustain that leadership position, and that becomes your brand, that you are the firm that can be trusted to provide help in this area.
So if I'm hearing you right, I think the way you prevent becoming commoditized is there's little pieces that are proprietary, but not enough that it scares someone. And would you say that in terms of the 3D printer and the maker space, what I think is interesting is, right, the 3D printing space, as I understand it, benefited hugely from patents, right? It was expired laser printer patents that allowed some of this space to move very quickly. But of course now, the recent big winners in the hardware space are asserting patents to keep people out. So I think the most interesting question in any tech space is what you described, is the balance between how can you stay open, both in your hardware or your software, and still maintain your position. And my personal feeling is that what you're seeing is if you embrace openness, you might get more customers, and it forces you to actually be much better at competition because you're not relying, and this is back to some of what my work is, if you think about IP as a type of regulation, right? It's a barrier. And whether or not we need those barriers going forward, if you think about the life cycle of a product, the question might also be, is 20 years too long for a patent when it's already superseded, except for the fact that the government has granted that. So that's a really great point, is that balance.
I think the traditional enterprise software model is not one where you like your enterprise software vendor. It's a relationship you have to be in, but you don't relish paying them again the next year. Right. And we very much try to reverse that, and we try to make sure that people want to do business and want to renew with us, and they don't feel as though they're forced to do that. They do so because they're getting value, and they want to come back year after year.
So this, I think, fits in with what Fujitsu has been talking about with human-centric innovation, right? It is co-creation of value, which I came to this, believe it or not, from the marketing literature for brands, is that companies started to realize that rather than being only business to business, right, only business to consumer, that it's this interesting back and forth. I think the biggest ongoing questions will be, if someone really generated something and gave to a company, they're going to start to say, how come I didn't get a piece of that? Which is why the equity question still baffles me. I don't get why that many people are continually willing to give a few bucks towards a new item. I'm old school. It's like, if I'm investing, I hope to get something more, but maybe, at the same time, if it's 10 bucks and I know I'm going to get the perk, that's enough. So it's a fascinating empirical moment, both from a business history and a kind of a sociology thing too. But forgive me, this is the law professor in me that reaches to the ologies. We promised not to talk too long. That's about, we have a lot of time here, and we were asked to keep it to relatively 10 minutes apiece. Totally open to questions, or we can keep going, but hopefully you guys have questions and we'll try and answer them. We've solved the universe now. Remember, I'm a law professor. I'm into cold calling, no? Yes, please.
So I'd be interested to know your perspective on just that whole patent issue. Because as we're seeing the barriers to entry go away and the product cycle gets shorter, does the need for patents in a lot of different product areas start to go away?
I can go to that, but
I think patents just become impractical in software. It's hard to define things precisely, and it's difficult to identify what's going to infringe and what's not, and it just hinders business. And if you look at the lawsuits that are being fought, they're not productive. They're not helping consumers. They're not even helping the companies who are building software. They're just a net cost. I think the other two legs of intellectual property law, trademark and copyright, are strong and play very important roles in software. But patents, I don't think serve us well in general. I've filed patents and I've been sued over patents. I've been involved in this for a while. I'm married to an attorney, so I speak from some experience, and I just don't see it as providing any utility to society in this case, in that realm. Whether in medicine and other areas, manufacturing, there might be value. I don't have the experience to say.
Well, and just to play a little devil's advocate, I think software, there's some really good studies that suggest, to your point, it doesn't work the way we hoped it would, right? On the flip side, think about it. You're a small inventor. You've gone to tech shop. You know that you can kind of go big. You can maybe go to Indiegogo, but people might like to know, gee, did you have a patent on that? Right? For a whole host of reasons. It signals, right or wrong, someone thinks that this is protectable, right? So that might get you more money. In addition, if you don't have a lot of other options, you might start selling to the big players that are paying attention, right? As Mark said, some people are coming in and licensing. So the patent portfolio in a lot of areas ends up doing a certain type of work. And while the whole troll or non-practicing any issue is out there, it turns out if you pay attention, it's not entirely clear that it's not providing value to people who could never have taken it to market. Now, the most interesting thing going forward, to your point, is maybe today they could take it to market. So the whole question of, is it creating a gridlock or not, right? Or is it a new version of we never thought patents would end up being this weird chess game or shuffling of money game. I think that's exactly why the question of what does human-centric innovation make sense. To me, it's the fact that Indiegogo exists and that Cloudera exists that means that even if I'm a small inventor, I might be able to go get that money, but do I need that patent signal? I think we don't know yet. But it might be that enough people don't care anymore, that they go, that book was just cool, right? It's a light, but it's a book. I don't know what it is, but I want it. And that can roll so quickly because of what's going on that maybe it becomes, you're done. The problem's going to be if any of us really put in that sweat, and maybe it takes us a little faster if we're really good, but maybe it takes us longer. The idea that, wow, now it's out there and anyone can copy it, having a legal backstop becomes a big deal. So maybe it's a question of the length of time. One of the big challenges is narrowing claims. There's some really nice work. My friend Mark Lemley down the road at Stanford has done some work as well as I think Colleen Chen as well as over at Santa Clara. A lot of really good stuff about can we take the patent system and cut it down so that it's not just this weird thing where you walk in going, clearly, there are days when I start to read enough about it, I feel like I must be violating a patent just by walking. Right? And that can't be right, to your point. Please.
So, Deven, you raised the question of why would people spend money on Indiegogo or one of these other sites in order to support a product where all they get is the product rather than equity. I think maybe you have been a law professor too long, but rather than my trying to express my opinion about why that would happen, I'd love to hear the panelists' view on that, because you guys must have thought about that extensively.
Yeah.
You probably thought about it more. I mean, I've thought about it to the degree that I've invested in some and got a watch out of it that I like, I wear every day. But
I hope it was on Indiegogo.
I'm not going to comment.
So, yeah, it's interesting. When we started, they were wondering where the market was. Are people really going to give away their money online through a site like this? It was obviously a big risk because you're not buying a product. You're not putting down your money and that thing gets shipped to you tomorrow. Perks can happen months down the road, especially in the technology space. It can be a year or 18 months, and people are literally buying perks and waiting the 18 months, but they want their updates, they want the feedback. So, we've kind of bucketed it into 3 areas, but perks is one of them, that they get this thing, whether it's the actual product or whether it's a t-shirt, it doesn't matter. What they're passionate about, just as far as if it's an album or a band that they're following, or just discovery through the site. And the discovery is the big piece. Also another piece where they get to come and explore and maybe find new things that they didn't know existed. And so it's a new space. We crowdfunded the first baby 5 or 6 years ago. There was a woman who wasn't able to give birth, actually tried to go through her insurance. They said no. And she did a crowdfunding campaign to get IVF and had the first crowdfunded baby. So there are things like that are happening that people are really excited about. I know, you can't believe it, but there are stories like that people are discovering and exploring. And technology is just, our hardware division has grown 1,000% in the last year. So this is where people are still looking, even though they can't get equity, they're still getting to be a part of something that they're passionate about. And I think, it's true in crowdfunding, it's true on Indiegogo, it's also true in life, but here now there's this system that does have checks and balances. Because think about it, if you had to go and raise $5,000, in the past, before crowdfunding existed, you would be knocking on friends' doors. If you were a small startup, you'd try to go to VCs. I think Indiegogo went to 90 VCs before it actually got its seed round. Right, and now we could probably crowdfund. We didn't crowdfund it, but we could, because we're talking, people are giving millions at this point. So I think equity is the next step, where people are willing to invest but it's investing in something that they hope will succeed. Money is certainly kind of the reward, the product is part of it, but it's really not money first. And then we see campaigners come online, to get their product to market in the hardware space is, of course, one thing, but we've really watched this market evolve over the years where market validation and focus group, Fujitsu, huge company, global, and I'm sure, I've worked at big brands before, spent hundreds of millions of dollars on research, and yet a startup can actually go find a community and really do their own focus group research and make changes. We had Misfit Shine, I don't know if you've heard of that product, is now sold in Apple stores. They raised $1 million on Indiegogo a year and a half ago. And they actually changed their accessories based on feedback. So they didn't know everyone wanted a lanyard. The entire comment section was, it would be really great if you had this on a lanyard. So they created, as part of the design, a lanyard that they could then go sell in to an Apple and say, here's why this is going to be a successful product in your market. We have all this data. And we have built in those things, campaigner dashboards and data analytics behind the systems. So I think there's a lot of things there that add value, that going and just making a simple purchase doesn't invest you or anyone who's interested in this space in the same way.
But, by the way, I do get it a little, but I was partially saying that it's interesting in terms of the quantity of money that it's shifted. Because, again, copyright was one of the first places there was, and it was interesting because the first instance that I knew that was before Indiegogo or Kickstarter, anyone was around, was there was a woman who was a jazz vocalist and had been on a big label. And this was a while ago, and I wish I could remember her name, but she had already a pretty big career, and she was one of the first to go directly to her fans on her website and say, I just want, I think it was 20 grand for some studio time, that's all I need, and you'll get perks. She didn't call it perks, but that's what it was. It was, you'll get the initial pressing and some extra signing, and you will be part of my fan base. Not only did she self-produce it that way, it went on, if I'm not mistaken, to win a Grammy. Now, at that moment, everyone said, well, that's only because she was free writing on the industry as it was, right? She had been built up as a name. What's fascinating to me is, in fact, what you described, right? That you can go out and say, this is who I am, and you don't know who I am. I'm random crazy law professor guy who's never done it before, but this is my pitch. And this is then the interesting connection is, well, people are deciding, and if you can, I don't know if you can say, but do you have a sense of where funding tends to come from? Is it, tech-centric cities, or is it relatively broad-based, or does it vary quite a bit depending on the pitch?
Yeah, I do have that information. We get contributions from 224 countries and territories around the world. So this is not specific to North America, certainly by any extent. It grew fastest in the English-speaking markets. Canada, UK, Australia are our second, third, fourth biggest markets. But certainly, we have Germany up there, we have France, and it's just expanding. And I forgot what you asked.
Well, I'm just curious, so at that point,
as far as data,
is it tech-centric, or is it more cities,
right.
or?
Yeah, so it's definitely, we just actually went through our own research and did our own study in the last month, and we did find it's double the amount of awareness in urban markets. And, and very small in rural, like 1% awareness in rural markets. So again, it's just where it's faster to adopt. I don't think that's any surprise, just kind of underlined where the data. But as far as tech versus arts, we do have markets where, or cities, Toronto, we have people who are more interested in us for music and film. And in the US, hardware and film are our two biggest categories. In Australia, right now, it changes, but cause is one of our biggest categories, and music. So it is interesting to see. But these entrepreneurial centers, whether it's Israel or Silicon Valley, they're evolving and changing, and they're actually helping develop our platform with us in a way, indirectly. But we're constantly getting feedback, obviously. We have the crowd who's using our platform every day, and we have about 7,000 active campaigns going on any given day, and we are transferring millions of dollars every week of funds raised. So it's a large marketplace.
It's fantastic. Other questions? Everyone's tired. No? Yes, please.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Definitely, the more success you can hit, the more established, Indiegogo will be, right? My question is, do you have any checklist or data analytics to guide you to decide who you can support or which entrepreneur you will support, or it doesn't matter?
Well, in the same way that eBay did, and we certainly, they're completely different marketplaces right now, but it had the personal and professional user, if you will. We definitely do market to those users in different ways, and it is a choice as far as, just coming from the marketing perspective, you're always making a choice of how you want to amplify and maximize your dollars. And from that, we really focused more on the professional. And what we mean by professional here, in our case, is not a hobbyist, someone that is at a tech shop and really wants to maybe come up with the next big idea. There are hobbyists at tech shop, but the ones who tend to use our site tend to do multiple products. Mark had mentioned a gentleman who had 8 companies, and we're seeing a lot more investment in their time, and they tend to drive, of course, a lot more of the volume in the funds raised that we see. And that's a space that we see blowing up, and where we're tending to invest right now in moving that market. There's a, thank you.
Please.
Great discussion so far. Question is regarding open source movement and wealth creation. You talk about the business models being changed, and what motivates people to continue with the open source movement when they don't see an immediate gain in wealth? As you know, the software hobbyists and people spend nights and nights. They get pleasure out of writing code, but are there opportunities for wealth creation in open source?
Definitely there are. I think the myth that it's people slaving away at night voluntarily primarily is not the case. There's some of that. There certainly are hobbyists, but the majority of open source development today is done by professionals as part of their paid employment, and their companies see the benefits. They're either using the software directly themselves and want to see it improved, but don't want to maintain it entirely themselves. They want to be able to make some incremental improvements and then maintain it together with a community of others. And I think in terms of overall wealth creation, you see more wealth creation because people are more free to adopt more software and further automate and then work to improve that software for their needs And I think it actually accelerates industries to have access to open source and to be able to participate in the open source process. Then you get vendors like Cloudera, where we are incented to contribute to the open source because our customers want these changes. They're paying us to be the people who are competent to make the changes, even though there's no unique access to those changes. It's simply having them at all and having them in a timely manner and in a suitable form is something that people pay for. It's a different style of economy, certainly. You tend to get these, I think we'll tend to see fewer of these concentrated empires built up that we've seen with Microsoft and Oracle and folks like that who built their fortunes on proprietary software. But and there's more of the revenue is distributed among all the users and contributors to the software. But I think there's actually greater overall revenue generated and returned to users and to contributors. Certainly my personal experience, if I had tried to build a business around Lucene, then I probably would have as commercial software, I would have fallen flat on my face because there were other people out there already who would have done a much better job of that. So the open source is out there. It's now enabled Netflix and Zappos and the dozens and dozens of companies which use Lucene to power their sites to have a powerful search experience at a lower cost and improve their profitability, enable them to build their businesses in some cases more readily because they had access to this open source software. So I think it's to summarize, not primarily done by amateurs. There can be businesses created directly working on the open source, but moreover, the overall economic impact is greater, I believe, in general with open source. If you look at, Linux, Linux has had a huge impact. You think about the size and the number of businesses that have been built around Linux which wouldn't exist otherwise. That's something we all benefit from.
The VC community has shown love towards open source and towards Cloudera. Are there other companies in the same league, or do you see something coming very soon?
I think in the Hadoop space, the space we're in, there's certainly been good VC attention. I think we're approaching probably an era of a little bit of consolidation. There may be, but that's natural in a new industry. I think in general, yes. I think VCs are very aware of the new ways of doing things. They look for folks who have a model that can succeed. In many cases, it's a model which can lead to an acquisition exit, which is still beneficial to the VCs, but not necessarily building an independent, profitable business. In the case of Cloudera, we're certainly targeting the latter, heading for an IPO, which. But there's definitely a lot of, we haven't had trouble raising any of our rounds. And I don't think our competitors have either, so.
Other questions? Well, we're coming near the end. I'm going to just start to wrap up if you don't mind. It dawned on me listening to some of the questions in terms of, Shannon's response about where investment's happening, some of the things that have been said this morning, some of what Doug was saying, is I would suggest that the two big things then that we're seeing, there's incredibly untapped stuff going on, ready to be opened up, as was pointed out this morning, in many spaces when you think about data, certainly, right? So some people forget Walmart was one of the first really big data companies. They didn't use today's big data science.
They do now.
They do now, right? But they absolutely, there's some papers from the 80s pointing out that the way they got to where they were was they were extremely good at leveraging, understanding what each local Walmart was doing. And managers are allowed, as I understand it, to then study what was working, and they would have almost real-time data about, yesterday this is what sold in that guy's store 10 miles from me when it was placed on this part of the shelf, right? That was old, clunky by today's standards abilities. Now you add in the data analytics. Think about what you could do with things like, and I think about Airbnb, believe it or not, Lyft, and Uber, and a little bit in the Indiegogo thing too, right? Which is, again, these were all things that previously, if you wanted money, there was no way you could break through, right? Indiegogo changes that. Because with the network, you can go through and find that. And the data gets better, you can make better decisions. But then you think about right now, right? The most interesting thing is, one level to me is, actually it has to do with data, funding, and local food. There's a really interesting debate going about whether local food is actually economically sound and sustainable. I think it can get there, but you then start to look at all the possibilities across, say, the farmers who are able to maybe go back and say, you know, if you give us this tool, we can do that. So if you're in the audience thinking about where the open world is, I would say, frankly, get out of Silicon Valley maybe. I don't know. But I'll bet you that the amount you could do if data starts to hit all these other sectors in the way it's starting to, and you were to start to crack open the old school worlds more and more. I mean, think about, you know, things like SodaStream, right? How many, all of a sudden Coke is starting to have to pay attention and figure out maybe we don't bottle anymore and we sell the syrup directly. I have a feeling they're gonna have to figure that piece out. But, you know, someone else can come along and say, yeah, you don't even need them, come to me, I've got my own cola formula. Indiegogo just fired that up and you've got a SodaStream, you're good to go. So the notion of co-creation of value in terms of our theme, right, the impact on traditional models, I think every company has this interesting dance nowadays of where can I not be commoditized and where can I get customers to realize it is an actual virtuous circle feedback, right? I think that's kind of what Cloudera is trying to do and certainly Indiegogo as well. And so, yeah, some of my old school lawyer moments where I have to ask, really, why are people doing that? It's not that I don't know it's going to happen because I have bought things on that model. It's fascinating because a lot of the assumptions that you are taught in business school, you hear is you got to clamp down, right? So in the patent world, it's you got to get that patent and go after anyone who's, call them a thief, right? Silicon Valley's better about that, but not always. And so I think the biggest questions about the impact on traditional models is assume the model's wrong and test and be willing to test and fail and test and fail because that's what's happening right now. And where Fujitsu brings in the ability to realize that it's at every layer of that. It could be small players that feed up, big players that feed down, and it goes across. It's one of the reasons I love being a law professor and when I litigated too. No one actually knows what's going to happen next, so you can have a really fun time and, you know, make some money along the way as you figure that out. And the real thing is getting people who are willing to hang out their shingle and say, let's try this from a completely inverted perspective where I don't even know what to call this yet, right? So with that, if you guys have any closing statements, that's how I see it.
I think you summed it up well.
Yeah.
All right, well then, again, thank you all, and thank you to our hosts at Fujitsu. This has been fantastic.
Deven, Shannon, Doug, thank you very much. I think we started the morning off, we framed the question, and we're getting towards the heart of the theme, which was open, shared, and democratized. As a salesperson, I can validate that compute power and storage are shockingly inexpensive. Thank you, Doug. So we're spending a lot of our, in trying to translate this to people. Salespeople really do try to be helpers. We're spending the majority of our time in helping customers figure out what do we do with all this data. I mean, it's a big topic. It's troubling for a lot of us, and I think that's what we're really trying to get at here. And how can we connect and share more effectively? And how do we adjust to the consequences, intended and otherwise, of the speed, access, and volume of information that our kids see now, much more, and that they're more accustomed to, perhaps, than we are? And how do we, I thought Doug's comment about collaborating with competitors is very real and fascinating in the world of access to information. And benefits. How do we extract value from technology to move towards what Fujitsu coins the phrase of a human-centric society? And I think our question is, how do we confer the greatest benefits to the largest number of people through technology? So those are just kind of the thoughts that I had as a wrap-up of this morning's session. And it's time for a lunch break. So outside our doors, you can pick up your box lunch at the tables in the grand lobby. And if we can resume at 1:20 for our next panel session entitled The Future of Manufacturing with Digital Technology. Also, just my last housekeeping note, please remember to return your survey to the registration desk at the end of the day to be entered into a drawing to win a Fujitsu scanner. So thanks very much for your attention. We'll see you at 1:20.